we're going to actually talk about the book a little. And I'm going to first ask you just about the main character, just this guy, Race. He's a remarkable human being. So just tell us, walk us through a bit of the story just as an introduction and who he is and just the temperament and the resilience he shows through this story.
Race is a Bangladeshi Muslim immigrant to America. Arrives in America in 1999 to New York first, and 2 years after that has come actually as an Air Force officer from Bangladesh, the highest position in his society, but still wants something more that he feels has eluded him, and that is to work in IT in America, which in the late 90s seems, before it all goes wrong, the best thing you could ever achieve. And comes to New York, is convinced by an old classmate to move to Texas, where he finds the bathrooms to be as big as the bedrooms in New York, and is starting to build this life from the very bottom in a gas station, working in a gas station, working behind the convenience store counter, with that dream of IT in his mind and a planned wedding to his longtime fiancée a few months ahead of him back in Bangladesh. And a few days after 9/11, Mark Stroman, who represents a very different America, walks into the gas station, asks him, "Where are you from?" Race says, "Excuse me," with a slightly melodious accent, and is shot in the face by this man with a shotgun that sprays 39 pellets into his face. He thinks he's dying, but he doesn't. He's blinded in one eye, but he doesn't die. And in that moment makes a promise to God, as I think all religious and secular people would, which is, if you save me, if you bail me out of this moment, I will do whatever you want later. And many years later, after tending to himself, healing himself, wrestling with debt, the American healthcare situation, which considered being shot a pre-existing condition, kicked him out of the hospital. After dealing with all of that, 10 years later, is very moved on a pilgrimage to Mecca and decides that it's time to repay God, and thinks for a year about how he can do that, and comes to the conclusion that publicly forgiving the man who shot him and then fighting to save his life from the death penalty is the best thing he can do. And the last thing I'll say is that, the reason he wanted to do that was not just to save this guy, and the reason we're having this conversation, but because he felt that the guy who shot him wasn't a fluke, that guy emerged out of and was the extreme expression of something wrong in America more broadly that he wanted to intervene in and stop.
Okay, so let's talk about the other guy, Mark Stroman. First, his social background. I mean, this is a tale of two sorts of, not poor people, but two sorts of aspiring people. So Strowman's background.
Strowman is the picture postcard of the America that used to work a lot better than it does right now. So white working class, Texas, works in body shops most of his life, not the face creams, but the other kind. In and out of prison for small stints since boyhood. In and out of meth and other drugs since boyhood. Marries, has children, has some of the hallmarks of a kind of middle class stability, or the kind of bottom rungs of it, and has a lot of other of the hallmarks of a really failing America, and kind of straddles these worlds, and seems to spiral out of control in that summer of 2001. Seems to be doing a lot more drugs than normal. But has always had this racist reputation, has always had this sense that America was losing something by being kind of nibbled away by these immigrants and minorities and liberals. And when 9/11 happens, it becomes for him this moment where I think he understands what he's about, and that why he's here and what he has to do, and goes to 3 gas stations. And so the part I didn't mention already, which I should have, is that he went to 2 other gas stations and shot two other clerks in the same way, and those two died, which is why there was a death penalty to begin with.
So is it accurate to say he's a guy who somehow has this sensation the America he knows and loves is somehow slipping away, and 9/11 is, well, it's slipping away. He's rising, he's doing okay in his work, and then he slides for some reason before 9/11, and then 9/11 is a trigger.
It's so interesting. He wrote a manifesto at some point, I think in a prison letter, describing as best he could his motivation. It's not a great explanation of why he exactly did what he did. But someone was saying to me the other day, the closest document it reminded him of was Osama bin Laden's fatwas, that it's this kind of scatterbrained, massive document that weaves together all these different grievances, some of which were, we spend public aid, foreign aid on countries, and they're not grateful, and they come over here and attack us. And some of which is minorities are stealing all our welfare benefits and having crack and squirting out babies, as he put it, and that the government is just giving them. So it was a bunch of different grievances. And if you read his manifesto of why he did it, he managed to jam a lifetime of grievances into that attack. So all those things are in that manifesto. The foreign aid grievance, the minorities grievance, the fact that you can't even speak English anymore in Texas grievance, it all was managed to be pinned on them coming over here and flying these planes into those buildings.
But was it primarily an economic grievance or a cultural grievance, that we had a homogeneous culture, or we had some sort of culture, and now it's just totally unrecognizable?
I think cultural. Yeah. I think, but the question there is he, is some of the dispossession in his world driven more by economics, but certainly the way he saw it and his understanding of his own anger was cultural. We are losing who we are.
Right. And one of the charismatic figures or interesting figures in the book is his first wife, Tina, who has a weird love for him through what comes and goes depending on how he behaves. But I think at the end, even after all this has happened, she says, "I love me some Mark Stroman." I mean, I
would lay down in a mud puddle just to keep his Tony Lama boots from getting wet.
Yeah. So that's so tell us about her.
Exactly. What, you've never felt that?
Are there any more like that?
Who among us has not felt that?
Yeah. Well, your boots are inspiring me right now.
Exactly.
So.
I hope my wife would protect these boots. She seemed to me a much simpler person than him. I spent time with her. I was not able to spend time with him. I spent time with her and three of their four children. And she was this woman. They got married when she was 15 and he was 16 during his third attempt at 8th grade. She lived, it was an area called Old Seagoville Road in Dallas. It kind of looks like rural Alabama, but happens to be in Dallas. And he would actually escape from his parents' house and live with his grandparents around there. And his grandparents were quite more prosperous than his parents. So she had the impression that he was this guy from a kind of better family than hers, and she was a half Mexican, half white, kind of working class family girl, and she was taken with this guy. And she, over the course of her life, with him, and then after they were together, they broke up in about 1990, 1991, just drugs, again, ate her life away. And, where we live here, there are drugs, and drugs eat some people's lives away. But we're really talking about communities here where it switches from being a minority of people to being a majority of people who live this life. And there's nothing actually exceptional about her life. And she finally, towards the end of my time with her, is able to spend several months sober and says stuff that would sound like it was out of the Heritage Foundation more than anything else. She said, I never understood personal responsibility until these last few months. I realized I'd never paid rent the last few months. I just thought all the things in my life were just things that got paid for, and I never understood the connection between what I do and the outcomes I have, and now I've understood that.
Yeah. So there have been a whole series of books sort of on the bifurcation of the country, coming apart or the unwinding. Tim Noah has a book. And some of it is this story, the sort of the social decay, especially the white working class, and sometimes in contrast to immigrant groups who are rising. But one of the nice things about your book is, since it's at a granular level, you can see individual responsibility in individual cases. And there's in the middle of the book, Race is talking about freedom. Here, meaning America, we think freedom means whatever I want to do, whatever I want to say, that is freedom, but that's the wrong definition. That's why people end up making mistakes. Freedom is not whatever you want to do, whatever you want to say. Freedom, by its racist lights, is nothing but responsibility. So how do you look at these characters? You spent time with, not with all of them, but with a number of people in the milieu. How much do we blame them? How much do you hold them responsibility? How do you interweave the environmental and the individual?
I think the thing that was a puzzle for me is, if this was just a book, let's say I'd just written a book about the Strowmans' world, I think it would have been very easy to come to a conclusion that America is suffering from diseases of individualism, or that there's this kind of social fabric fraying. The trick that I had to wrestle with is, while all that is happening, there's another character in the story, Race, for whom the same America, the same city, works phenomenally well. After being shot, he rebuilds his life, he gets education, he works at the Olive Garden, he finds a guy at the mosque who teaches him IT, he gets a job at reputable travel companies online. He now runs a team of server engineers in Austria from a base in Dallas, working out of his house. America worked for him. And so he and I actually talked about this a lot. And I said, how do you see them versus you, their America versus yours? And I think part of what he talks about, which is very interesting to me, is this, he said, I come from a collectivist, communal society where there's too little space for the individual. And I came here because there was too little space, and I wanted more space, which is why a lot of us come over here. It's why my parents, who are here, came here. And he said, that worked for me. But I see, because I was shot, he says, and because I got to therefore be connected to these people who I never would have otherwise been connected to, I got to see that the same selfhood and freedom and individualism that worked for me and people like me doesn't work for people like them anymore. And maybe that's because I have more resources than them. Maybe it's because I have certain habits and values which I gained before I got here. But the idea that the same thing could refract so differently in different lives was very powerful to me.
Now, how accurate would it be to say, Race has high IQ, I assume, and ambition, and an amazing disposition, by the way. I mean, even at the moment of being shot or waking up in the hospital, the guy is upbeat. I mean, temperamentally blessed by the gods. And Mark just probably has a much, much lower IQ. And so you have one system with people with high IQs and good dispositions are doing really well, and people without.
Yeah, but I think Race would argue that that's not probably the primary difference, even if that was an outcome. When Race was fighting to save Mark's life from the death penalty, he had to make a bunch of legal filings and cite his arguments. One of his arguments was that Mark should not be executed because Mark did not have access to the kind of loving family that Race had access to. And I think part of Race then, after fighting this case, got to know Strowman's children and has been sending money to Strowman's children to try to save them from becoming like their father. And so he's now met more than one of them. He's met the whole world. And his view is that there's nothing fated about this. That if you have, bad parents, you have, less than two, and often, most of these cases, less than one. You're being raised by grandparents because your parents are addicted or in jail or both in many cases. You simply don't have the same shot at accessing the great things of a country that still totally works terrifically for a lot of people.
Now, you look the way you do. Tell us about reporting Strowman's family in that social environment.
When I first got in the car, I hit what Amber, who is Mark's oldest daughter, she wanted me to pick her up in her town, which she lived in Fort Worth, but she wanted to have her sister be in the interview for kind of moral support. So we picked her up in Fort Worth and drove to Stephenville, I think 2 hours away. And so first thing that happens in the car is she says, it's a rental car, I'm driving, and she kind of mentions that she recently got out of jail as a convicted felon for burglary. So So I'm thinking, I hope rental cars are not to her liking. And a few minutes later, she says to me, so are you interested in this story because you're from over there too? So at first, my instinct was say, no, of course not. Of course not. My brain is not connected to my skin. And then I thought about it, and I said, the honest answer is I don't think so, but I also think it's not unrelated to my sense of the world and the kind of questions that would interest me. I said, okay. And then a few minutes later, I knew it was going to be okay, because I was asking her something about how she saw her life chances, and she said, now, do you believe in karma? Because I do. And I thought, okay, this woman's telling me about karma. We're going to be Barack Obama's post-racial America may still be upon us. And spending time with them began with a skepticism that I think is wise. I mean, I was coming into their world. I was asking a lot of questions. I wasn't just asking about what was happening right now, but really about what had happened to them since birth, and them making, to me, his children are even more interesting than him in a way, than Mark Stroman, because Mark Stroman's an outlier case, clearly. If you're on death row, you're not a normal person. His children are much more normal people, and yet they're failing in many of the same ways. And so it really, Mark Stroman, I don't think most of us in this room would say he's our problem, right? He's his problem. But his kids, I think we'd all start to say, if we're generating a lot of people like this, systemically, and Amber's junior high school teacher was dealing her dope, meth, in Stephenville, it starts to become a little bit of our problem. And over the course of time I spent with him, probably over a year and a half, 2 years, fortunately a lot of trust was built. Tina became comfortable enough with me to tell me what she said was Mark's worst anti-Indian joke, which I will never ever tell you. But she told it to me, and it was actually a sign for me that we had built a certain rapport. And I really liked them. To me, it was really different from thinking about a criminal alone. These were good people who, by a combination of bad choices and lack of choices, have ended up in a really miserable condition.
Yeah. If I could just make one point about social trust, I've always thought it's an amazing sign of social trust in this country and a lot of countries that you can walk into a storefront, hand over a piece of plastic, and they give you a car to drive away.
Yeah.
And apparently they do it for felons convicted of burglary. And that's a level of just trust, social trust, that we take for granted, upon which our capitalist system really depends. If you don't have that social trust,
Absolutely.
You can't have so many industries. But let's go back to the schoolroom, just to explore this social environment. So there's a lot of drugs floating around, apparently including school teachers. Why are the drugs being taken, or why are the lives being led the way they do? And let me ask that better. Do they have social aspiration? Is there no social aspiration? What do you think is lacking, or what did you find was lacking?
I think it's a very dire combination of a lot of the things the left is worried about in America and a lot of things the right is worried about in America. And the problem is we don't face it because everybody's only interested in half the problems. So the left is very interested in, we don't have very good psychiatric care, we don't have great drug treatment, we put everybody in jail, we have a war on drugs, the job market's not as it should be, etc. The right's very interested in moral decay, why don't people form families anymore, and there are very few people in America who acknowledge that both these things are problems. You're one of them, which is why I love your column. And I look at this population of people that I got to spend time with, and it was so interesting to me reading the newspapers, coming back, the debates don't correspond to their reality. And they will tell you that their own lives are the way they are because of this combination of their bad choices and really bad structures, and the interaction of the two. And so, the drugs are available, and we're not fighting a very effective war that they're available. But in our effort to fight the drugs, we're also locking up such a high proportion of their men that basically these are functioning matriarchies in a lot of these places, but not the good kind of matriarchy. Matriarchies where everybody is hoping that the men will come around and be better next time, and all these phrases, and don't. And that great phrase, "all the devils are here," to me really applies to this world.
Okay, I'm going to open up to the floor for questions in about 4 minutes, but I want to ask 2 final questions, and they both have to do with religion. Race goes to Mecca with mom. Describe that, what that does to him, and how it shifts the trajectory of his life.
I think I would say that Race came to America as almost entirely in the kind of classic mold of a very devout conservative Muslim who, in a way, to whom the next world was more vivid than this one. And part of his remarkable journey over the kind of 10 years that I report on is he retains that, he stays true to that, but he acquires a very American this world orientation that mingles with it. And so for those 10 years after 9/11, he's really focused on first rebuilding his health and then on aspirations. He buys a sports car at one point. He first says, "I'm not going to sell alcohol" as the Olive Garden, and then says, "Okay, I'll sell it," and then becomes the top grossing alcohol seller at the Olive Garden. But still has this other side to him. And when he goes to Mecca, I think he kind of feels tapped on the shoulder by God, and has this little moment where someone falls on his head while he's praying and breaks his nose, and he just feels God is telling him something. And the thing that he feels he's telling him is, "I saved you. You said you were going to dedicate your life to others." And it kind of calls him back to that other side of, what's my real legacy play here, to put it in kind of Aspen Institute language, but what's my next world play here as well, and reminds him of that after spending a lot of years focused on this world.
Okay. Now, actually, if we're going to do Aspen, we have to mention the word scalability.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very Aspen
Exactly.
word.
Exactly.
Now, the final question. So Mark becomes a Christian at the end, just before his death. What's your understanding of his faith journey, and whether it brought him peace and how it affected his family and all?
It was probably one of the 2 or 3 most important things that happened to him. So it's worth saying, even before the religion thing, that one of the things that happens for him, but a lot of people who go on death row, is that partly because of logistics and money, all the people they knew before getting sentenced to death fall out of their lives, and they maybe never see again. He maybe saw 1 or 2 people who he'd ever known before after he got on death row. So all your old influences are gone. And all the new people who come into your life tend to be religious ministers, pen pals from around the world who feel bad for you and write to you about their day in Bristol, England, and all kind, a documentary filmmaker who's from Israel and gets to know him. And the combination of all those influences, among which religion was very important, changed him and helped him to see himself. And the religious aspect was very important because I think it helped him really understand that there was that his whole life had been kind of anti-humble in a certain way. And I think he gained a humility in seeing his own smallness and seeing himself as part of a tragedy rather than having to be the hero of his own story. And he said to his children on the day that he was scheduled to be executed, while Race is in a courtroom still trying to argue to get him not executed that night, and he calls his daughters and he says to his daughters, "I will always be the same knucklehead I've always been, but if you don't get your heart right with God, this would have all been for naught."
I'm going to ask a question. I'm just going to make one statement. Just on those 2 scenes, Montaigne, this 17th century French writer, he was riding down the street, and one of his servants ran. His horse took off and ran and knocked Montaigne off his horse, and Montaigne lands on his head. And to the outside world, Montaigne is scratching at his clothes and screaming in agony. But internally, Montaigne is thinking, "Wow, I'm so calm." And he's very near death at this moment. And he had this moment of peace. And his lesson he draws from this in later essays is that nature will teach you how to die. that at the moment, nature will teach you how to do it. And it just occurred to me now, because there are two near-death, or one actual death moment and one very near-death moment. And Race's reaction to walking around having blood flowing out of his head is amazingly calm and self-conscious.
And it's amazing, one of the things that I found very moving is and telling is that when Race thought he was dying, all the thoughts in his mind were about his family.
Yeah.
And he, it was like this slideshow of his mother and his father and his fiance and his 7 siblings. And when Mark was very close to the end, his final thoughts were about, in a way, his own salvation. No one besides him came up. And that was, to me, an interesting and telling difference.
Okay, questions from the floor. One right here.
How much time
We're on tape, so if you could wait for the mic.
How much time were you able to spend with Mark? You said you didn't have that much time with him. I was curious.
0 time. And so one of the kind of strange things about this book is I have, it's really about these 2 men primarily, and I have 2 very different sets of reporting in a way. So one, Race, I met a lot, I interviewed him, and the other I have kind of the most extraordinary paper trail on, because if you are sentenced to death, they will gather, even in Texas, they're very thorough, they will gather really every piece of paper that any government agency has ever acquired on you. And it's thousands of pages, several boxes of paper. And one of the things that was interesting for me, just as a kind of reporter of the story, is I realized, I think my impression going in would have been, if you can meet the guy, it's always much better and more revealing than if you have 4,000 pages of documents about him. Not true. There's something inherently unreliable about a conversation with people because of your limitations and theirs and memory. Having this paper, I had Mark Stroman's physical exam result. The doctor is saying he has a bruise here from 9 years old. I had every address he'd ever lived on. I had the names and dates of birth of his friends who I could then look up. And by the way, any name that came up as someone who knew him when he was 12, 13 years old, they are also in jail today for violent crimes. So he comes from a social world where if you were like pals with Mark Stroman when you're 12, you were destined, So it's interesting. I felt they were equally weighted in terms of what I was able to get out of them, but very different relationships to a source.
Okay. Right here.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Based on what you've read and everybody you've interviewed, is Strowman crazy?
It's a great question. I would emphatically say no. But it depends on your definition of crazy. I mean, there's another sense in which anybody who would do this is crazy, right? And I think in the rhetorical way we use crazy, yes. But in the kind of legal sense of like, did he know what he was doing? Is he capable? Does he have hallucinations? None of the above. And it was actually interesting for him because on death row, he was surrounded by a lot of people who were really messed up. And it was actually a bit of part of his actually growth, I think, came from being around so many people who were genuinely messed up and realizing how fortunate he was, that he wasn't most of the people on death row, that he actually had a sophistication and intelligence and a kind of capacity that outstripped most of theirs.
Can I just follow up?
Are you a reporter?
I hadn't thought of that professional possibility. I'm just sort of curious, the group of people that you've met and interacted with, are they more or less interesting than the group of New York Times reporters?
Are they more or less crazy?
Exactly. Less neurotic, more interesting.
Right across the aisle.
We have something called the 9/11 Unity Walk here in Washington, D.C., where people of all different faiths put aside their differences and go down Embassy Row. And every year, people say, well, you should have maybe less speakers and more human interest stories. And this year we're thinking about the Sikhs and the person that threw themselves in front of the Sikhs in Wisconsin and protected them. And I'm trying to think about your story and trying to think. Well, there are a lot of children in the audience, so maybe that answers my question right there. But the story and the movingness of the story, I'm trying to figure out whether that's appropriate for the 9/11 Unity Walk venue.
I think it is. I mean, I'm biased, but there's actually very few moments in the book that are violent or, there's these shootings, and I use the coroner's report to describe what the bullet does inside the body. Besides that, it's really a story about real people and their kind of struggles to redeem themselves in different ways. So I don't think there's much inappropriate for children. But I don't have children, so I don't really know about them.
Did you have a question back there?
Thank you. Having spent so much time with this group of people who you describe as really, kind of almost without promise, and this is a big sector of our country, what might you be able to share about what we do to help these people? Are they above redemption?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think that necessarily means that if it's all we helping and they don't do anything, that'll work either. But let me say this. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think part of what makes America different from a lot of other Western countries that are worrying about decline, and whether it's France or any number of other countries, is that America still has this ultra high level capacity and institutional functioning. France is not churning out Facebooks and Googles and Harvards and Yales. It's kind of a more general decline, right? There's a part of America that still works better than any other place in the history of the world. Today, still, probably for most of us in this room. And so I think the simple answer is plugging that America into the America that's not working. If I was answering the question in France, I don't know. I feel there's just a more generalized lack of relevance and decline. But if you just think of the universities we have, if I look at most of my friends who do startups, and I live in New York, and a lot of our friends do startups, they're great companies, but they're companies that are innovating for me and people like me and helping me find lattes more efficiently than I could already find them, or helping the worst off people in the world by going to Rwanda and running, But there's a woman who wrote a great piece about the unexotic underclass, about the people in between the worst cases in the world in Rwanda and people like me looking for lattes. And that's the single mother in Mississippi who makes $18,000 a year and has no daycare options and bad health care, whatever. The people I know who graduate from the great universities, the students you teach at Yale, I actually don't think they're very interested in those people in the middle. And they're very interested in those extremes. We're still a very innovative country, but we have to decide who we want to innovate for.
Okay. Maybe back in the corner over there.
So this is a little bit of a follow-up from that question, and you mentioned the role of responsibility for Mr. Strowman's children after he was locked up, and that this is something that reoccurs, all over the country. And, it's a big point of debate on both sides of the political aisle. Is this a personal responsibility thing? Is this something the community needs to step up, churches, et cetera? Or is this something that government institutions play a role here, and taxpayer dollars should go to trying to support this? And I wonder, kind of your own personal views on, what we can do, what you think seems right for kids. And
Again, it's not really my field, but one observation I would make is the way we think about who we give resources to as being who's in need and who do we give is mostly economic, right? If you have this much money, you qualify for this program or you don't. Part of what's interesting in this world, like most of these people in the Strowmans world are not on welfare. I don't know if they don't qualify or they don't want it or whatever. They're not on welfare, most of them. Their poverty is of a different and less measurable kind. It's like people who don't have parents, Well, I'm not sure that actually qualifies you for special benefits, but making $15,000 a year does qualify you for special. We have a lot of different poverties going on here. We have, if your father is in jail, do you get? I don't know actually the law here, but do you get welfare benefits even if your income's okay? I don't know. I don't think so. So I think we have to really think about who is hurting and what actually hurts kids. And have a much more, Paul Tough wrote this beautiful book called How Children Succeed that really kind of broadens the discussion around what really makes kids succeed and what makes them fail. And it's a lot more complicated than being low income. I just don't think we're having that conversation in the way that we could be, that's based on kind of a granular understanding of these lives as they're actually lived.
Okay, maybe right here in the front, keeping you running.
Can you say something about the relationship between Mark and race? And can you say something about the relationship between Mark and race and whether they got to meet each other, and then whether race took from that beyond helping the children and all, whether he has some societal goals or something that he's hoping for in this world now?
They have never met again physically, but they, in a way, race came to his decision to fight to save Strowman's life without meeting him, talking to him. It was an internal epiphany. But once he did, he desperately wanted to talk to Strowman. Once he got to that place, he actually came to the view that I cannot heal and complete my own transformation without talking to him and helping to transform him. I must change him to change myself. So he got to speak to him once on the phone on the scheduled execution date. But I think the broader mission that he took away was that this, as I said earlier, this American dream that worked so well for race, in race's own view, so clearly had not worked for Mark. And once he kind of understood that, the mission had to go broader than saving Mark's life. So he has now tried to first help these kids, not become their dad. And he's founded an organization, which you all should look up, called World Without Hate, where he's trying to do a bunch of different things, from fighting hate crimes, but also more broadly raising this principle of forgiveness, which, as he points out, was a much bigger idea, is in every major religion, and was a much more prominent idea in every religion in certain points in history than it is today in almost all of those religions, from Islam to Christianity and everything in between.
I'm looking and not finding their final. They have a transcript of their conversation.
Yeah, I've been around this a few more times. The final conversation is quite a sad and strange moment. You want to read it, or should I?
It's it.
Mark says, this is the last day of the scheduled life of Mark Stroman. Mark says, "Race, how are you doing, Race?" Race says, "Hey Mark, how are you, buddy?" Mark says, "How are you doing, man?" "Hey man, thank you for everything you have been trying to do for me. You are inspiring. Thank you from my heart, dude." Race says, "Mark, you should know that I am praying for God, the most compassionate and gracious. I forgive you, and I do not hate you. I never hated you." Mark says, "You are inspired, Race." Race says, "And this is from the bottom of my heart." Mark says, "You are a remarkable person. Thank you from my heart. I love you, bro. I love you with all my heart. Thank you for being such an awesome person. I mean it." Race says, "You will always be there." Mark says, "You touched my heart. I would never have expected this." Race says, "You touched mine too." Mark says, "Hey Race, they are telling me to hang up now. I will try to call in a minute." And that was it.
We have time for a couple more. Maybe way in the back. I'm doing you a favor, trust me.
It's part of the Michelle Obama, let's move.
Yeah.
I'm interested in all this conversation. We haven't heard a word about the Texas penal system. Would you comment on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the sad thing is that while Texas's penal system is particularly extreme, the system in which Mark Stroman found himself from childhood is sort of our national system, with a little more picante in Texas. But this is what we do with a couple million mostly troubled young men, many of which have done really terrible things. It's not a question of them having not done those things, but our way of dealing with this kind of pretty mass problem of what seemed to me, from looking into this world, almost like a kind of stillborn manhood in a lot of these people. Boys who gained the kind of muscle power of men and the ability to drive and shoot things of men without never necessarily transcending kind of an 8-year-old's level of development. And at one level, it's very hard to say we shouldn't arrest people who do these things or who break our laws. I mean, that's nonsensical to say that. That's what makes this a rule of law society. At another level, when I think it's 2.3 million people are in jail, and the 2.3 million number is deceptive because in Mark Stroman's social world, it's not 1% of people, it's like a much higher percentage of people. And in our world, it's a very low percent of people. In his world, if you don't have, like, everybody has like someone in the military and someone in jail. Let's put it that way, right? In our world, a lot of people don't have anybody in the military and anybody in jail. And I don't think we have grappled with what to do beyond just saying they broke the law, they need to go to jail. How to think about this as almost a rite of like this kind of negative dystopian rite of passage in so many of our communities, and the only place we know to put broken boys.
Okay, one more right here in the middle.
Thank you very much. So, talking about the penal system, we've got a multi-billion-dollar prison business going on in the United States. It's interesting this should happen in Texas, and I wonder what happens when you have teachers who are supplying the kids with meth instead of teaching them to read, because we know if fifth graders can read, when they can't read, they are going to start acting out. There's a lot of guilt and shame. I can't read, so I'm going to start committing crimes because I've got to prove myself. And the prison system is, they plan the number of prison cells based on fifth grade test scores and dropout rates. So it's like,
I think it's easy.
Perpetuating
I would say
everything
if I looked at Mark Stroman's life and the life of his friends, I would say there are 3 failing institutions broadly, of which the prison system is one. But the first, and by the way, most of these kids are pretty done being damaged after the first, is parents, right? The inequality of access to good parents is by far the most important source of inequality in America, right? And we can't talk about it. And again, this is the kind of thing where liberals and conservatives can't get together and talk about it for different reasons, because each side's only willing to talk about half the issue. So there's a parent problem. Then there's the school system. And you're absolutely right that if this is what's going on. That said, I saw a lot of his report. There seemed to be teachers that were trying, but he seemed pretty broken by the time he entered the school system. And then there's the prison system, right? And those are almost the 3 kind of steps. And there was some dispute when I was trying to report this story about where he got his racism. And there were a bunch of people who said, until he went to prison, he talked a lot of smack about everybody, but it was never racial. It was only when he got to prison and was very quickly instructed that, the Anglos are here, and the blacks are here, and the Hispanics are here, and you better get in where you fit in, as one of his friends said, that he kind of acquired that. Now, I don't know if that's right or not, but he also married a half-Mexican woman when he was 16 before those prison sentences. And so we have these kind of 3 institutions that we're passing a lot of people through. Remember, the 2 million is who's in jail now. It's a much larger number who have ever done a stint in that school. And it starts to be a pretty large number of people in a lot of communities who have passed through all 3 of these failing institutions.
Okay, we should close it off. We're a little late. We've heard sort of the outlines of the book. Trust me, there's a lot more in it. So you should buy it. A truly fine book. Congratulations, Anand.
Thank you so much.